Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sarah Hunter. I am the head of policy at X, and I'm delighted that we are going to be joined in a chat with David Miliband. Now, I met David many decades ago when we both worked for the Labour Party. He was actually working for a think tank at the time, but then fast became a politician, rising to become foreign secretary, but then left the UK 5 years ago, David? 6 years ago? 6 years ago. To come and run the IRC, the International Rescue Committee out of New York. Described, I hope all of you know who IRC is, but described by Fast Company as the most under-recognised yet influential non-governmental aid group in the world, working with 26 million people in 40 countries. So doing really important work with refugees around the world. So we're going to have a chat about, well, we started by thinking about all of the global crises facing the world, from climate crisis to the pandemic to a forthcoming economic crisis. So let's start there. David, what's IRC doing currently in the face of the global pandemic?
Thanks very much, Sarah. Nice to be with you. Watched your inexorable rise over the last 20 years with admiration and respect. So nice to be able to do this conversation with you, and hello to everyone in the audience. So the International Rescue Committee is a global humanitarian charity. We were founded by Albert Einstein in 1933 to rescue Jews from Europe. We helped 2,000 people escape with fake passports from occupied France, including people like Marc Chagall. And today we're a global humanitarian organization helping actually the 31 million people whose lives are shattered by conflict and disaster survive, recover, and gain control of their lives. We have 13,000 employees and 17,000 auxiliary workers in 200 field sites in 34 countries. And we're also the largest refugee resettlement agency in the United States, with 25 offices around the US. But as you'll know, the Trump administration has reduced by 3/4 the number of refugees being allowed into the country. So this bipartisan program has been struck down so that instead of 200,000, which was the number who came under Ronald Reagan, or 90,000, the number who came under President Obama, we're down to 13,000 this year under the Trump administration. We work across the arc of crisis, from the war zone in Syria, in northwest or northeast Syria or Somalia, to the internally displaced who are fleeing for their lives, to refugees who've crossed a border, to integration into high-income countries where a minority of refugees end up going. We went into the pandemic, if you go dial back to February, that we were living through the worst humanitarian crisis since the Second World War, more people fleeing violence than at any time since the Second World War. We learned last week that the total number of people fleeing violence and persecution is 79 million. That's about 45 million internally displaced, 29 million refugees, 4 million asylum seekers, who are refugees who've claimed a refugee status but haven't yet got it. The pandemic has hit. It hit rich countries first, but obviously we had to go into emergency mobilization mode. And the crisis has now reached Latin America. We're very worried about Colombia, very worried about Mexico, obviously. I'm very worried about Venezuela. And it's coming to South Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan. And we are very concerned also about some of the large countries in Africa. Nigeria, the largest country in Africa, Democratic Republic of Congo. And in those places, it's not just that the underlying health conditions of the population are weak, it's that the health infrastructure is next to non-existent. There are 100 ventilators in the whole of the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has 100 million people. And so to finish, we're trying to work on what we call the double emergency. There's a health emergency that is threatening lives, and there is an economic and social emergency which is threatening livelihoods. The health emergency needs to be addressed with prevention that's still possible in many of the places that we work. Even refugee camps like the 1 million-person Rohingya refugee camp in Bangladesh. And it's one of the interesting things is that people think refugees are in rich countries. They're actually in poor countries like Bangladesh. There's still room for prevention and for healthcare. There's room for more water stations. There's room for fever testing. There's room for isolation centers. But also tackling the economic and social consequences. Violence against women. I was speaking to our team in South Sudan on Friday. Violence against women, including female genital mutilation, skyrocketing in many of the places that we work. And obviously people living on an economic precipice now in danger of falling over. So we're trying to address the second part of the emergency as well. We've gone remote. we're an $800 million organization, and we've raised over the last 5 years the amount of money we spend on IT from about 0.5% of a $400 million budget to 2.5% of a $800 million budget, and that's allowed us to go remote. So we've gone remote, and that's allowed us to make sure that we're achieving the business continuity that's so important. So we feel that there's a tsunami coming to the places that we're working, but it hasn't hit yet, and we're hoping that we're going to help people survive, recover, and gain control of their lives.
So prior to Corona, talk to us about how the refugee crisis was unfolding. It seems to me that the influx, or the sort of the journey of refugees around the world has changed a lot over the last decade. There's a lot of civil war that's generating a lot of refugees. The climate crisis is also making it, talk to us about sort of what you see at a meta level, how refugees have...
So the meta level has 4 aspects, really. One is that refugees are the product of civil wars, not wars between states. So there are, depending on how you classify the India-Pakistan standoff or the India-China standoff at the moment, this is a world without wars between states, but has wars that are civil wars. And so top 5 generators of refugees, Syria being the prime example, is a classic intra-state conflict. Secondly, the refugee experience is an urban experience, not a refugee camp experience. 60% of refugees are in urban areas, not in camps. Thirdly, it's a long-term experience. Once you're a refugee, you're more likely to be out for 20 years than for 2 years, because less than 3% of the world's refugees went home last year. And it's a youthful experience. Half of refugees are under the age of 18. So those are the meta trends. And actually, they speak to some of the work that we've done with Google to try and empower refugees, because the risks they face and the opportunities they have are different, obviously. In a refugee camp, you're guaranteed food, healthcare, and a modicum of education. In an urban area, you've got none of those things, but you've got the opportunity to work and get somewhere. So it's sort of swings and roundabouts.
And how do you see the next 10 years? How do you see the sort of the change coming down the road? I mean, obviously Corona slightly sort of throws the whole thing into sharp relief, but you talked about the economic crisis as well. Where do you see shifts coming?
Well, I think that there's a dystopian version of the post-COVID or COVID future. I mean, in the places we work, there isn't going to be COVID for a long time. It isn't going to be post-COVID for a long time. We're going to be dealing, even if you think a vaccine is going to come next year, it's not going to come to South Sudan, it's not going to come to Yemen, it's not going to come to Northeast Nigeria. So it's at least 5 years, maybe even 10 years before it's properly done. So we're living with COVID for a long time. And the fact that half of it is asymptomatic obviously helps. The youthfulness of the population helps. The fact that people are outdoors a lot actually helps. But I think that there's a dystopian version of the future, which is that trends towards nationalism, towards isolationism, towards xenophobia, towards inequality are actually galvanized by this, powered forward by this crisis. It's a huge concern that the lockdown, it's not just COVID is disproportionately affecting people of color in America, it's that the consequences for city budgets, for after-school programs, for all the things that create ladders of opportunity, they're also compromised by this. And that's doubly or trebly the case in the places that we work around the world, where we're helping pretty much the most vulnerable people in the world. 8 out of 10 countries that we work in are off track to meet their sustainable development goals. So we're talking about people who are being detached from the global mainstream. And so there's a dystopian version. The alternative is not sort of utopian, but you can imagine that global health is taken more seriously, not less seriously, as a result of this crisis. You can imagine that global holes in the safety net are taken more seriously, not less seriously, as a result of this. You can imagine that in some areas there is a recognition that thinking beyond your own national boundaries is essential to not just morally but strategically, and that people begin to say, well, America first, to take that as an example, or China first, doesn't mean just thinking about within the walls of your own fortress. It's got to mean how do you engage globally. And so I would say that's common sense. Some people would say that's utopian. But I think that there's a chance of making that case. And I think in something like global health, you could actually see a lot of progress. I think that given climate and other things, the net likelihood over the next 10 years is that we're going to be dealing with more inequality, not less. But there's a fight on to try and limit it.
Yeah, I do. There does seem to be a gap right now between the way politics has gone down a much more populist, much more divisive route, and the way people seem to be emotionally reacting to the current crisis, which is around much more community, much more desire for investment in public services. There seems to be a sort of disconnect, if you like, between decision makers and the way a lot of certainly the popular opinion seems to be placed.
Well, I hope you're right. I don't know. I don't think we've got enough data points on that. We know that the AfD in Germany has lost support, but we don't really know yet. You can make the argument people have seen the value of immigration in their health services. People have seen the importance of global action. People have pulled together to help neighbors who can't get out. But I think we don't have enough data points. I hope you're right. And it's certainly striking that the worst performers in the crisis have been America, Brazil, Russia, Britain, 4 countries that have had so-called populists waving a tide of the politics of anger, but the politics of anger doesn't get you anywhere in respect of fighting a disease. There's no point in being angry with the disease. You've got to deal with it. And so I think that, I would say that there are some pretty clear lessons, but I think it's premature to say that that's the general view.
Well, maybe, certainly the last month and the initially US, but now global reaction against structural racism and the sort of, what I think is sort of unprecedented levels of, if you like, awakening of people. I live in a very, very quiet town in the UK where there were like many thousand people protesting against structural racism, which I've never seen before. That seems to be a sort of indicator that certainly there's something else afoot amongst the general population. To what extent does racism play a role within the work that the IRC does, or what role has racism had in the refugee crisis?
Well, to state the obvious, we were founded in response to an unspeakable act of, or multiple acts of racism. I think that it's important to pick 2 dimensions of our modern existence that speak to the structural racism, the structural issues that you refer to. One is obviously we are a US headquartered organization. So we reflect some of the scars, the inequalities, the injustices of America's history since 1865, or even America's history before 1865, all the way back. Its failure to deal with its legacy post 1865. So there's that form of inequality and injustice. There's also the fact that we are in the main funded from the quote unquote global north, and we work in the main in the global south. Now, of our 13,000 employees, 96% are not Americans or Europeans like me or you. They are, we're both Europeans, but you know what I mean. They are, in Syria, we've got 800 staff, they're Syrians. In Yemen, they're Yemenis. In Central African Republic, they're from the Central African Republic. But we've still, you've got, if you're looking at it, you'd have to say, well, that it's a feature of the humanitarian sector that there's this north-south issue, which is itself the source or a reflection of some historic injustices, it's related to but separate from the structural racism issue. They've both got to be called out, I think, and recognized. I think that it's been incredibly, we've been going through a strategy process over the last year, 9 months, involving 2 people elected from each of our country programs in a strategy assembly, a core group of people that's extremely diverse. And so both sets of issues have been bubbling and addressed inside the organization. But I think you're right to say that there is a global moment of significance. And one of the most moving things of the last 4 weeks for me, 3 or 4 weeks for me, is people saying, look, I remember I had a black member of staff say this to me, because there's been a lot of listening, obviously. And she said, look, I remember Rodney King, 1992. And so part of me says, this is just, we're going through the same motions again. But another part of me says that this could be different. And so from our point of view, we want this galvanizing moment to be different, in that there is not just listening and talking, but there's actual actions that, and we're going to follow that through in our own organisation. And obviously, that is that's a global and certainly a US-wide issue. It's slightly strange for us in that we're a hybrid. We're American headquartered, but we're a global organisation, and most of our staff are not in America. We have probably 1,000 staff in America and 13,000 staff around the world. So we've got to think of this as the US having its specificities, but so do Pakistan has its specificities. Nigeria has its specificities. We've got to be able to speak both universally, globally, and locally.
There definitely seems to be a sort of critique of institutions that is coming through right now in the debate about racism, but also when you look at how people are commenting on the handling of the coronavirus. Similarly, there's a debate about institutions, like the appropriateness and how effective our institutions are being at responding to crises, I think is under question. Certainly in Silicon Valley, I think we have a bias towards thinking the past way of doing things just isn't going to cope with today's challenges, and we need to invent new solutions, technology being the tool that we turn to. Where's your head at with that, about sort of the role of institutions of the past and the need for new approaches to deal with the future?
Well, the organizations which survive are those that envision the future and can adapt and embrace change. And so I think that there's room for insurgency, and Silicon Valley is a great example of insurgency. But there are also organizations that have survived for 200 years because they've had that ability to learn, to renew, to rethink. In Britain, the National Health Service has shown an extraordinary capacity to rethink and renew itself. So I think it depends how these institutions are run. I think it depends whether or not they have their eyes and ears open. And you don't need me to tell you that some of the insurgency in Silicon Valley, I don't know how to say this in the most diplomatic way, but...
Oh, be honest. Tell us what you mean.
Well, many of the insurgents in Silicon Valley would say today that they're worried that people who were insurgents 20 years ago now gobble up insurgents. And so there's a different kind of balance between insurgency and incumbency than there was 20 years ago. And so I think that my own head is at the place that declaring year zero is not a very effective way of thinking about the future. Also, I mean, you've talked to me about this before. The people who forget that technology is an enabler rather than the end state, get themselves into the wrong place. And I think we've been able to go remote over the last 3 months because of technology, because of our investments in technology. But the digital revolution has not yet hit the humanitarian sector. It's not yet been harnessed, is a better way of putting it, for the humanitarian sector. And that's something that we want to do. We know that if we can arm our clients with the best of what technology can offer appropriately, because remember, a lot of the places we work haven't got decent connectivity. The hardware, people are on old-fashioned phones, not on smartphones. That emphasizes why you have to have human-centered design, not a smartphone in search of a problem to solve. And I think that's a really important discipline at this time. We also know, of course, that the technology sector has got questions to answer about to what extent is it fueling some of the hate, because that's something we're dealing with, the symptoms of hate. When you listen to the unbelievable stories of people who were chased out of Myanmar because of their religion and their ethnicity, and they're stuck in a refugee camp in Bangladesh, they will tell you that social media is a divider as well as a uniter, and so it's quite raw for a lot of people that we're talking about. But I think that my head is in the position, simply put, that the resources for doing good are greater than any time in human history, and so let's start with that, because some of the problems we face are greater than any time in human history, and so we better deal with them.
So give me, I totally agree with you, and actually, when we work actually largely outside the US as well. Most of our projects start prototyping and early piloting in countries that are not our home country. And starting with that humility about sort of accepting that you don't understand the user base, you don't really understand the problems, you don't really know how your technology will work in the real world is the right starting point. Have you seen in the groups you work with or the locations you work in good examples of how technologists have worked in partnership with those groups on the ground?
The simple answer is they do it when they embrace the principles of human-centered design. So if you start with the client rather than starting with your gadget, then you're in business. With another part of the Google franchise, we worked on something called Signpost, which is a brilliant now interactive online information and communications platform. We launched it after the 2015-16 refugee crisis in Greece. 1 million people used it. It was called refugeeinfo.org at that time, and it was sort of conceived as a way of people arrive in Greece, they switch on their mobile phone because those are refugees with a mobile phone, and it all comes up in Greek. Well, that's not very good. That's not very helpful if you're from Syria. So how can we have a local language, refugee language, trusted information site for people to learn? Well, where do I register as a refugee? Which shopkeepers can I trust? Where can I stay the night? How do I get my form done? What happens if I'm told by the police that I actually have got to go, be sent back? And so it started out as one-way communication, and then we've developed it now in El Salvador to be two-way. So if you're on the run in El Salvador, you can have 24/7 help. Not use it; it's using another company actually as well to get real-time information for a woman who's on the run with her kids from gangs. So it's you can see the potential of it. Now, the tech sector is more interested in inventing things than it is in scaling things. So that's a bit of a problem, really, because we think that this should actually be a global thing that was available to anyone who's a refugee, really. And actually, we did it in Italy. We used it recently in COVID to give information. 100,000 people used it in the first month, or in the first week, actually. So even in a country like Italy, which has got a lot of information, if you're trusted and credible, you can really play a role. So we'd like to see that going bigger. That's a really good example. Some of our education stuff is kind of interesting on how technology can be an enabler. But a lot of the children that we work with are very damaged by what they've seen, and they need a human touch as well as an iPad. I mean, you've got to think in more human terms. And obviously in healthcare, there's room to think about telemedicine as long as you do it in a appropriate way. And one of the silver linings of COVID could be that you get a push towards that sense of how's the digital revolution going to really help the most vulnerable.
Yeah, I definitely think there's an urgency to find solutions, and thus a willingness to try more, a willingness to, I think in the 6 months ago, there was much more of a perceived, certainly from a government perspective, risk at trying new things because the status quo was seen to be risk-free. Whereas actually, we've all seen the true cost of the status quo, which is, brittle supply chains and, frankly, quite slow reactivity with the healthcare system. So actually, they are recognising the cost of the status quo and thus the equivalent cost of risky things.
Well, some bits of the status quo have worked pretty well. I mean, if you're in Germany, you'd think old institutions that are consensus-based, that are, would have been described by some people as plodding, have actually protected people really well. Now, South Korea, you could say, okay, they've used apps and it's been much more with it. But I think that it's not clear to me that all aspects of the status quo have failed. I mean, even on the supply chains, our team in Bangladesh, because we take emergency preparation seriously, they were ordering PPE kit on the 8th of February. So, I'm sure the system's not perfect, but there are some things that have actually worked, and myopia prevents things working. So if you spend the first 2 months saying, well, the disease will go away, and then surprise, surprise, it doesn't, then that didn't work.
But I guess your organisation is used to crises. I mean, you are exact, and so actually many organisations were just sort of relaxed in the perceived sort of constant progress that they
That's a very
thought
good point.
their
And
country was
all the
doing.
government departments are stuck. So
Exactly.
government aid is not as hardly is being basically blocked. I mean, we're 3/4 government funded, and in this crisis we've been 95% private funded.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so it's a real problem. I mean, we're screaming that there's still time to save lives and get serious about prevention, and US, UK, absolutely unable to get money out of the door.
So that brings me to, we often have a debate internally, X, about sort of what's the role of the private sector in doing good. I think in the US, we are much more comfortable with the idea that the private sector can be part of doing good. Whereas in Europe, it's much more, it's public sector or not-for-profits who do good, and the private sector, it's all about, making money, and the good bit is sort of unnecessary. It seems like there's a much more sophisticated conversation going on now about the partnership approach between NGOs and public sector and the private sector, largely around sort of the emergence of the social entrepreneurial, the new phenomena of people who believe that you can make money and recycle that money back into the good that you want to be seeing in the world. Have you seen examples of those sort of partnerships working well? I mean, it's something that we're always interested in knowing more about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that where it's developed is now that it's gone beyond let's make a lot of money and then let's give it away. It's how do we do our business in a way which serves social good. I mean, we talk about corporate social results, not just corporate social responsibility. And that's so I think that there's a more of a let's be problem solvers. So there's more of it. And I have to say to you, there's a lot of boutique programs because different organizations want to have their little charity and that they do their little program. They want it to be different from everyone else's. And we always say to people, look, the best thing you can do is scale something that works. So don't try and reinvent the wheel. So there remains a sort of boutique philanthropy at small scale, which is means that the whole is less than the sum of the parts. And I think that's a problem. But there is better practice of people sharing ideas. There is better practice of people recognizing on the NGO side that the private sector is a potentially big partner and a big player, not just for writing a check, which is the historic sort of transactional approach. I think that there are there's still a lot of learning to be done. I don't think we understand your world and you understand our world. If your world is the sort of private sector world, I think there's still, there's certainly a lot of learning about our world, I think, to be done, because there's it's such a different way of life, really, for the people that we're serving, that there's a lot of learning to be done. But I think there's need for humility in that, and I think that there's also a need to embrace what we don't know, and that's something that is sometimes difficult for people from both sectors. I mean, I'm not sure it's right to say that it's Europe versus America, because public-private partnerships are not a new thing in Europe. What's true is that the European safety net for people in Europe is much stronger than America, and so people rely on government. I think that there's maybe, my perspective. I think I spoke about this at the Google Zeitgeist conference 2 years ago. That when governments are in retreat, NGOs and the corporate sector have to step up, and they have to step up together. And that's something I think we could do much better at, because we're not getting government leadership. We can't solve these problems without government. If they're not leading, then I think there's a lot of room for corporates and for the NGOs to step up together. Although it's interesting, in this COVID crisis, there's loads of people running in towards the vaccine. There's no one running into, well, what's life going to be like between now and when the vaccine arrives in South Sudan? And, we've got to run healthcare, we've got to run child protection, we've got to run education between now and then. And so even the most far-sighted philanthropists are not getting that balance right.
Yeah, there seems to be a lot of unknowns, and all of us are trying to sort of rapidly come to terms with the new normal in a way that our little brains can't really cope with. I was really struck when I worked a little bit with your guys in the Airbell Centre, your innovation arm, and I was really struck by how data-led the work of IRC is, and how much you truly research and respond to what you've learned on the ground. And, for example, direct cash payments are one of the things that you are advocates for. Like, rather than saying, here's our program and assuming that we know what's the best thing for for your users is you say, okay, well, they can spend the money. They can. What other sort of pieces of insight about that you've developed over the years would you want to share with our?
There's data on cost efficiency and cost effectiveness. So you've got to do things at scale. And if you haven't planned in scale from the beginning, then you've got a big problem because you're not going to get the effectiveness. We've learned a lot about education and how just giving people a laptop isn't going to work for them. You need guided engagement with technology. So that certainly informs us. We've learned a lot about how programs to help survivors of sexual violence, female survivors of sexual violence, are much more effective when they are integrated with economic empowerment programs. So we no longer talk just about gender-based violence. We talk about women's protection and empowerment because our programs show that when you help give women more economic empowerment, you have the social programs go further. So that's been quite data led. There are things to do with child protection. I'm going to get this wrong, but I'm not the expert on it. To do with we're the largest impact evaluation agency in the humanitarian sector, and we showed that community-based programs for stopping child abuse didn't work well, and they needed to be family-based. And so that changed the way the sector works. So that's kind of interesting. We've done a lot of research on malnutrition. There are 80% of acutely malnourished under 5-year-olds get no help from the UN system. And so we've shown how to have an alternative approach using community health workers and changing the way the health protocols work on malnutrition. So data is important. What's sorry to sound like a stuck record, but no one wants to pay for data. It's ridiculous. But we don't get you don't get any support for measurement and data evaluation, and that's a real problem. And so a lot of humanitarian agencies, including ours, struggle with getting the data management, data organization, data collection, data analysis done right. And so it's nice. I mean, I agree that Airbell Impact Lab has done really well, but that's not the whole organization. We've still got a way to go on that.
I'm going to turn to the Dory because we've got some questions from people who at X who joined on the live stream. Okay, so questions. Okay, Olivia wanted to know what's the one thing that technologists trying to tackle the refugee crisis often miss? In other words, what's our blind spot?
I think the blind spot is people, actually. That you all want a technology solution, and actually you need people. And so we try and emphasize that you've got to meet people where they're at, and it takes people to do that. So I think that's quite a big thing. I think that there's a bit of not invented here syndrome, and that's important. What's great though is that in our partnerships with you guys, you've got a real can-do. You want to get stuff done, and that's good. I mean, patience is a virtue still, I think, and so there's healthy impatience is okay. But I like the can-do. I think this point about scale is really important. The wanting to do a lot with a little is a recipe for disaster, and I think that trying to the global humanitarian aid sector is $28 billion. It's 40% underfunded. So getting a sense of, well, how can I have, if there's $100,000 worth of effort going in, let's understand what difference we can make with that. If that's what we've got, how we make sure that other people adopt. So there's not enough attention to, well, not just what's the innovation, but what's the adoption strategy for everyone else.
Yeah. Yeah, and how can it become replicable in other situations rather than just scaling the existing UI to many different communities?
Yeah, but one of my learnings is that replicability is a very poor guide to take on a bit to the amount that something's taken on. I mean, it always strikes me that I'm always trying to steal other people's ideas. We come up with good stuff, and people still carry on doing the bad stuff. And that so it's not just that something's replicable. You've actually got to what's your route to market. That's right. I think that's maybe our blind spot. I don't know.
Well, I think there's also because we are born out of a world where software scales very quickly. you don't necessarily think about the organizations who are already in the communities, already on the ground. Like, who are the people that they're interacting with on a daily basis that can be the sort of route to market?
That's a good point.
It's a question from Sarah Church. How open to taking risks and trying new technologies are refugee organizations, and maybe more broadly, sort of the humanitarian sector?
Well, I can't speak for the rest of the sector. I think for us, we are pretty open, but we want to take risks on small scale first rather than large scale. So we've learned yeah, exactly. We've learned that from you, I guess. So, we're proud that our Airbell, they start with 3 people or 30 people before they go to 300 people, before they go to 3,000 people. And so I think taking a risk with 3 people, or 30 people, we've done that with our violence prevention programs against women. And that's been good. Got some birds who seem to be nesting inside the wall of our apartment in New York. This is not a good sign.
It's nature, David. Nature's coming back.
Yeah, no, nature doesn't belong in a brick on the 3rd floor of a brick wall. It's slightly odd, but anyway, I apologise for that. So I think that we're quite a risk that meets the superordinate goal. I think we're up for. However, the sector as a whole is funded in a very risk-averse way, where ticking the boxes of the government grants that you apply for is it's risk-averse money, because often the government sector doesn't want to do that. So I always say to people, our private money is our risk capital. It's our venture fund, and we need more of it because the sector doesn't work well enough, and we need to find much better ways of doing things. And whether it be in employment or in education or in livelihoods or in child protection, we've got to do much better.
What would be, just to follow that train of thought, if there was, what you described, the refugee crisis seems to be incredibly complex and frankly a little bit overwhelming as a sort of problem to try and solve. But if you could focus attention on one bit of the problem where you would think it's worth taking risk, what would be the bit that you'd send people out and say, go fix this, and then we can make a massive difference across the board?
Well, I mean, obviously the most important thing to fix is one that isn't susceptible to a solution by you, which is the real question. The real solution is obviously how do you stop the wars in the first place? Because until you stop the fighting, then you can't stop the refugees. If you take that, and it's important to say that, because otherwise people often say to me, what's the solution to the refugee crisis? Well, there isn't a solution without political systems that embrace compromise and difference rather than reject it. But if you take that, I think there are 2 or 3 gaping holes in the way the world deals with the refugee crisis. One is education. 3% of the humanitarian budget goes on education. Half of the world's refugees are under the age of 18. 75% of refugees of secondary school age aren't in school. Most of them are in poor countries, not rich countries. So you've got a massive education crisis, which we're trying to push against, but which is, and when it comes to early childhood investment, which is the most cost-effective way of spending in education, it's absolutely nugatory, the amount of money that's spent on that. So, from Head Start and early investment in childcare, that's the most important thing. Tuppence halfpenny is spent on that globally for refugees. So that's the first thing. I think that, secondly, this malnutrition crisis is more manageable. 80% of acutely malnourished under 5-year-olds don't get help. 17 million of them are in fragile states. The UN has 2 different systems for severe and moderate acute malnutrition, delivered by 2 different agencies through 2 different protocols in 2 different systems that don't meet. We've developed a combined protocol for severe and moderate acute malnutrition, delivered by low literate and low numerate community health workers. That is a solvable lifelong trauma for 17 million people. Because once you've been acutely malnourished as a kid, it has impacts on the rest of your life. So that's a rather more manageable one. I think that the gender inequality issues are massive. That's a big part of our work. And it's not just, the violence against women and girls is the tip of the iceberg. And that's a incredibly powerful and important area. All races, all religions, the women and girls we serve are doubly, trebly, quadruply hurt and hit. And so whether it be early child marriage, whether it be domestic violence, intimate partner violence, whether it be poverty, that's a massive area that's waiting for help.
Okay, I hope everyone. I mean, actually, Philip Strassel said, "What would be your wish or your dream for technology to exist?" I think there's three really powerful areas.
There's one other actually, which is taking on fake news, because that's an absolute bloody nightmare for us. I mean, that's a nightmare in not just fueling hatred, but it's a nightmare in today. I mean, trying to persuade people that it's. I mean, you know this from America, but we're trying to persuade people that the health workers are not the enemy, that the disease won't go away of its own accord, that masks are the right thing to wear, that isolation is the right thing to do if you're ill. Even if you've got fever, don't take the risk that you've got COVID and they're going to spread it, because you're not going to spread malaria, but you might spread COVID. And so technology to help in the places that we work around the world that could help take on misinformation, that's a massive thing. Because we've got... Sorry?
That's very interesting. I mean, that's fascinating. I hadn't made that connection to fake news.
We've got local workers who are credible, but there's a bombardment in a lot of places of fake news. Sometimes the fake news isn't spread by technology. Sometimes it's local pastors or local community leaders.
And is it intentional misinformation, or is it just sort of, rumor, my uncle said, like, is sort of the natural spread of community information gone wrong, or is there something else?
It's both, because some presidents are saying, I mean, I'm not thinking of here, but there are presidents in countries around the world who are saying this disease is going to go away of its own accord. I mean, I'm not making an American political point. I'm saying that there are presidents around the world who say, look, we've got a pact with God, it won't strike us. And taking that on, as I say, humans are important, but there should be some. The technology has got a part to play in that.
Let me find another question. This is from Libby. When have you seen technology deployed to help with refugee issues fail? We're very big on failure, X. We're very big at trying to embrace failure and sort of come to terms with it before it happens, because otherwise you're not going to take the right risks. What lessons could technologists interested in working in this space learn from these failures?
Yeah, I think that, the things that come to mind are, I think the WHO issued a little alarm clock. It's not very high tech, I admit, but they issued an alarm clock so that community health workers could take the pulse of people who they thought had pneumonia. And the alarm clock went after a minute, and you were meant to count up the number of breaths. And if they were above a certain level for a different age group, that meant the kid had a pneumonia. And of course, the problem was that the community health workers couldn't count to 50 or 60. And so it was a misapplied technological, the alarm clock was perfectly accurate. But what we did was, we using human-centered design, effectively, we issued necklaces that meant that with beads on them. And so instead of counting the breaths, the community health worker just moved a bead on the necklace. And when it reached a danger level for a different age group, the color of the beads changed. And so you got around that problem. So I've seen, as I say, an alarm clock is not high tech, but that's a good example of how being really focused on the skills of the individual matters. We all know that in education there's been a lot of failure with computer-aided learning. That's a rich area for things that have gone wrong. As I say, the digital revolution has not really hit our sector, so there aren't that we need more failures. I mean, I don't mind saying that. Fast test, fast fail is something that our Airbell, you can all Google the Airbell Impact Lab and learn more about it and become huge funders of it. But we need more failure. I mean, like you say, it's an odd thing to say, but that's the way you learn.
Totally. And you have I think your bead example is a great example of designers making assumptions about what users can and can't do in the lab. And only when you get it into the field is it obvious that you made assumptions.
Exactly.
Question, I was going to ask on a personal question, but I'll ask David's question, which is, how does working in philanthropy compare with working in politics? Do you come up against the same problems or different ones, and what do you miss?
Interesting, yeah. I miss the power, I miss the power.
Because there was so much of it when we were in
look, there is less power you've got more power if you're in government than if you're an NGO. There's no question, but you've got fewer obstacles if you're in an NGO than if you're in government. That's I think, government, more formal power, more obstacles. NGO, less formal power, less obstacles, fewer obstacles. And in a way, if you're in government, you have the hope that you're an agenda setter. And if you're in an NGO, if you're running a humanitarian NGO, we are agenda takers. We have to deal with the consequences of civil war. We're not really in the business of stopping the civil war in the first place. And so that's a frustration. It'd be nice to swim upstream and try and do a bit more of both. But that's a big change. I think that in politics, people presume that you're lying when you start from, and in NGOs, people don't presume that you're lying. So that's quite good. I think it's very unfair, but I think that there's a presumption of at least some modicum of good intent. Whereas in government, if you're in government, a lot of people want to purvey the idea that you should start with skepticism.
You want to try big tech for the sort of assumption that you're working. The skepticism that people face, those of us working in big tech, is equally extreme.
Yeah, but you've got to be careful not to talk yourself. I'll never forget. I was Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and I had this dinner with scientists. And they said everyone hates us. And I said, oh, look, every profession thinks everyone hates them. I mean, if you were in the banking industry, you'd say everyone hates us. In fact, I spoke to someone this morning who was a banker who said everyone hates us. So I don't think it's true. What people think is that you've got a lot of power, and that it should, not you personally, obviously, but the sector has a lot of power, and it doesn't always use it. To put it charitably, it doesn't always use it in an effective way, and I think that's healthy. I don't think people hate you. I don't think that's right.
I agree that scrutiny is really is a good thing to come when you have perceived power. But I also think there are some assumptions about motivation that are not fair, and I think that's also true of lots of other people. I mean, I agree with you. It's a common misconception that you can understand people's motivations.
You don't want people to be in awe of you. You don't want people paying tribute to you. Equally, you don't want to hate you. I agree. But there are things that are common. I mean, the thing that I hate the most is always, well, the problem's so big that we can't solve it. And that's the biggest challenge that we face in our work. That people think, well, what can I do? I'm a Google ex-employee. What can I do? And then that's, I think, the biggest hurdle that people, and that's what the populists and the nativists trade off. The politics of anger trades on the idea that there aren't any answers. So you might as well do the demonization. And I think that's the problem.
I was going to ask you about that. What kind of I firmly believe that the quality of your team is basically everyone's success. Like there's no magic secret sauce. It's all about the quality of the people. How do you get your teams to believe these problems are solvable? Have you got any sort of like?
My problem is not my teams. The problem is people. I mean, you're almost by definition, if you join the humanitarian sector, you think you can make a difference. So the problem is not that my teams think that it's impossible. It's that the rest of the world thinks that they're impossible. And so that's that there's a collective action problem outside our sector, as well as collective action problems inside our sector, but they're different. And so the disbelief, if that's the right way of putting it, is not from people who are working for the IRC. The disbelief is that, well, I might as well just focus on fixing the homelessness problem in San Francisco because global problems are too difficult. Well, I mean, actually, the global problems are probably more difficult, but they're not insuperable. And actually, there are some simple things that could make a hell of a difference a long way away. And when you look at it, the homelessness problems in San Francisco are actually quite complicated when it comes down to the individual level. So I think you're right about the quality of teams. We're recruiting. We've got a more balanced group than before. There's a danger for any industry to have a sort of Stockholm syndrome, and we're getting some more people from outside, so it's a better balance. But you've got to work on it. We've got to do more to lift people up from who are our clients. We could do more to get our refugees to become our employees, but we need to bring them into more senior positions. It's a big part of our strategic plan. I
definitely think bringing outsiders into an organisation is a very powerful way to challenge get the best out of everyone. Like you need to bring the sort of the non-experts in together with the experts, and you have a much more creative conversation about what's possible.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, that's the idea anyway.
What would be the short-term thing that you would? I've got a question here from Wendy that I think we covered. In your opinion, what are the short and long-term actions technology companies can take to help with the global refugee crisis? I think we talked about some big moonshotty things. What about in the short term? Give money to the IRC, obviously. That's one short term.
Yes. I think, short term, it's about responding to the double emergency of COVID. Medium term, it's about mobilizing these resources to really break this sort of, it's not quite a culture of disbelief, but the fear that the problems can't be solved.
Well, we're a good group of people to say that to. We always believe the impossible is achievable. Okay, we're going to close out, but before we do, I just want to ask, is there one thing that you recommend people could read or listen to, a podcast or something that you wish everyone would read or listen to help them understand this issue better?
Other than my book, I can't nominate my own book. So
you be holding it up.
On this desert island, I assume that they've all got my book, Rescue, Refugees and the Political Crisis of Our Time, which I hope they enjoyed. The great thing about it is short. So
that's always a recommending factor. It's very short.
It's not as short as a Twitter thread, but it's only 30,000 words. So and I can't remember. $2.25 goes to the IRC for everything we sell. I mean, I'll tell you two things I've read recently, which aren't particularly. Are you asking about things to do with the work I do, or just sort of generally?
Anything you think is interesting. I'll leave it open.
Anyone who hasn't read Brian Stevenson's book Just Mercy should read it to understand race in America. Really powerful, really brilliant. I just read a book by Alec Ash called Wish Lanterns: Young Lives in the New China, which is about 6 young Chinese who are probably the age of many of the people. They're in the sort of 25 to 40, and it's sort of it shows you that in a one-party state you still get the same variety of human beings and human personalities as you do in a diverse, crazy country like this. So those are two things that I've been looking at recently. I think that the biggest thing that I would say to people is that, and it's a theme of the discussion of the last hour, and it's a big part of our work, is that the greatest crime of the nativists and the nationalists and the populists is to dehumanize people that they don't like and they don't agree with. And that's what's happened to people who are victims of conflict around the world. It happened to my parents' generation, obviously, and it's happening in this generation. And so I think that thinking about how you rehumanize people who've had their dignity and their humanity robbed from them, I think that's a very important theme. And if you can harness technology to do that, then that's a great thing to do.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much.
Of course.
It's an incredibly wide-ranging and thought-provoking conversation. I'm really grateful to you. We'll go away and buy your book.
I always do what you tell me.
Exactly. Thank you so much, David. I'll speak to you soon.
Sarah. Nice to see you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye now.